Lando Norris arrived in China as the champion he was ready to dominate. With the clock ticking, he recorded a time of 1 minute and 31.504 seconds, an impressive time that placed him at the top of the timesheets. His pace was so devastating that he left his closest pursuer, Ferrari's Charles Leclerc, 0.454 seconds behind, an unusually wide gap in modern Formula One. Beyond the final time, what was striking was how Norris achieved that time. On his fastest lap, he made a slight error at turn 1, losing some tenths of a second. However, his ability to make up time on the rest of the circuit was impressive. In the final 2 sectors, he set absolute records, displaying absolute control over the car and a speed that no one else could match. McLaren's performance was further cemented by Oscar Piastri, who finished third on the timesheets. The British team's solidity was evident. Their car seemed perfectly suited to the demands of the Shanghai circuit, combining top speed on the long straights with stability in the high-speed corners. Behind the 2 McLaren drivers, the times were closer. Lewis Hamilton, in his second race with Ferrari, finished in 4th place, but 0.691 thousandths behind Norris. George Russell, driving Mercedes, was 5th, 0.873 thousandths behind, making it clear that none of the rival teams were close to the Britain's pace. One of the most striking data points of the session was Max Verstappen's position. The 4-time world champion finished 16th, a misleading result, as Red Bull opted to abort their only attempt on soft tires for no apparent reason. The true pace of Verstappen and Red Bull remained a mystery, but what was clear was that McLaren had a car capable of dominating. The general feeling after free practice was that Norris was not only the favorite for sprint qualifying, but that he had the potential to take the entire weekend in China by storm. But in Formula One, performance in one session doesn't always translate into final results. What happened in sprint qualifying completely changed the picture. Everything seemed to indicate that Lando Norris would maintain his dominance in sprint qualifying, just as he had done in free practice. During the early laps of the session, Norris demonstrated great pace. In SQ1 and SQ2, he not only advanced without complications, but even led the second phase, showing a solid performance on every lap. McLaren still looked like the team to beat, and everything pointed to Norris being in contention for pole position. However, in the decisive phase, SQ3, the situation changed completely. On his first attempt at a flying lap, exiting turn 13, the car suddenly oversteered. This loss of stability caused him to lose acceleration time, compromising his speed on the backstraight. Despite the incident, he still had one last chance to fight for pole position on his second and final flying lap. With the pressure on, Norris tried to squeeze the McLaren's performance to the limit in the final seconds of the session. Everything came down to his final lap, but on the final corner of the circuit, he made a crucial mistake, locking his brakes while trying to brake too late into the corner. The front left tire completely locked up, preventing him from taking the corner on the ideal trajectory. This forced him to abort the lap, losing any chance of improving his time. The result was unexpected. After dominating practice and much of qualifying, Norris was relegated to 6th place on the grid for the sprint race. Meanwhile, Lewis Hamilton surprised everyone by taking pole position for Ferrari, his first since the 2021 British Grand Prix. The contrast between the practice session and sprint qualifying was evident. What hours earlier seemed like a weekend of absolute control for McLaren and Norris turned into a completely different scenario. The Briton went from a half-second lead over his rivals to just half a second behind the pole position. In his post-session remarks, Norris didn't hesitate to take responsibility for his mistake. He explained that he had tried to brake too late into the final corner, causing the lockup that ruined his lap. He also acknowledged that the team had struggled more than expected in the session and that they simply hadn't been fast enough. But beyond the one-off mistake, his words revealed a deeper problem. Norris mentioned that his car had become more difficult to handle in qualifying compared to practice. The stability the MCL39 had shown in the morning was no longer the same, and the changes on the track, especially due to the increased wind, further complicated the situation. This detail raised a new question. Was it just a driver error or was there also a problem with the car? Sprint qualifying raised many questions about the McLaren's true performance and how this might affect the rest of the weekend. Lando Norris not only made a mistake in sprint qualifying, but also hinted that the McLaren MCL39 was experiencing problems that hadn't manifested themselves in free practice. The British driver's subsequent statements were key to understanding that his performance in the session was not solely due to a driving error, but to technical difficulties that directly affected the car's performance in qualifying conditions. From the start of the weekend, McLaren had demonstrated superior pace to its rivals. In the only free practice session, Norris led by a considerable margin over Ferrari and Mercedes, creating the impression that the MCL39 had a performance level that would allow it to challenge for victory without major complications. However, in sprint qualifying, the situation changed dramatically. The car that had seemed so solid in the morning became unstable and difficult to handle when it mattered most. After the session, Norris acknowledged that the loss of performance was not solely due to his mistake at the final corner. He admitted that the car had been much harder to drive than expected and that the team had encountered issues that had not manifested themselves in practice. His words were clear: "We struggled a little bit more and just weren't quick enough." One of the most worrying points was the MCL39's extreme sensitivity to wind conditions. Norris explained that the car was much harder to handle in strong gusts, something that was evident in sprint qualifying, where the wind was more intense than in the morning. This vulnerability is not insignificant, as Shanghai is a circuit with long straights and high-speed corners where aerodynamic stability is crucial. If the McLaren fails to maintain predictable behavior in these conditions, it could be a recurring problem throughout the season. The Briton also compared the situation to what happened in Bahrain at the start of the year. At that race, McLaren had suffered from front-end instability and difficulties finding the right balance for the car in unfavorable weather conditions. The worrying thing is that, despite the progress shown in subsequent races, this problem remains present at circuits like Shanghai, which could indicate that the MCL39's weakness in windy conditions has not been fully addressed. Another key aspect to consider is the new FIA regulations on flexible wings. Before the Chinese Grand Prix, the International Automobile Federation implemented stricter regulations limiting the flexibility of rear wings. There was speculation that this measure would affect some teams that were taking full advantage of this area of the regulations to gain aerodynamic advantages. However, Norris made it clear that McLaren had not been affected at all by this new directive. He even suggested that the British team might have been too conservative in this regard and perhaps should take more risks in the development of their car. While these regulations don't appear to have directly influenced McLaren's performance, the question remains: do they truly have a car capable of dominating the championship, or could these weaknesses compromise their performance on circuits with characteristics similar to Shanghai? Sprint qualifying left more questions than answers, and the team will have to carefully analyze what adjustments they can make to regain the advantage they seem to have at the start of the weekend. The challenge now will be to find a solution to mitigate the MCL39's sensitivity to wind and optimize its performance in qualifying conditions. While race pace remains a mystery, sprint qualifying made it clear that McLaren doesn't have a perfect car and that the title fight could be much tougher than it initially seemed. Lando Norris will start from 6th place in the sprint race at the Chinese Grand Prix. It's not an ideal situation, especially after having shown absolute dominance in free practice, but he still has a chance to make up ground. The key to his comeback will depend on several factors, including track strategy, tire management, and weather conditions. Unlike Sunday's main race, the sprint is a shorter event, which reduces recovery opportunities and makes the start a critical moment. The first lap will be decisive for Norris's aspirations. If he gets off to a good start and gains positions in the opening few meters, he can put himself in a better position to attack in the following laps. However, if he loses time at the start, any comeback attempt will be complicated. In this type of race, overtaking can be more difficult due to the smaller difference in wear between drivers' tires. In a long race, tire compounds degrade unevenly, creating opportunities to overtake rivals with tires in poorer condition. In the sprint, this advantage is not as evident, meaning Norris will need to find opportunities to overtake on track without depending so much on the wear of others. Another key factor will be the McLaren's top speed on the straights. In practice, the MCL39 demonstrated a good balance between speed and downforce, allowing it to set competitive times in all sections of the Shanghai circuit. If this performance continues in the sprint, Norris will be able to take advantage of the DRS on the track's long straights to try to overtake his rivals. The weather could also play a key role. During sprint qualifying, the wind negatively affected the McLaren's handling, something Norris mentioned in his comments afterward. If the weather conditions remain similar in the sprint race, McLaren may need to adjust the car's setup to mitigate this issue. Should the wind intensify, the MCL39 could become even more difficult to handle, making the comeback more difficult. On the other hand, the performance of their main rivals will be a determining factor in the fight for positions. Ferrari has shown significant progress, with Lewis Hamilton taking pole position for the sprint and Charles Leclerc showing competitive pace. Mercedes has also been in the mix, with George Russell and Lewis Hamilton making the most of their car in the pre-race sessions. If these teams maintain their pace, Norris's comeback will depend not only on his own performance, but also on McLaren's ability to match Ferrari and Mercedes' race pace. Regarding team strategy, McLaren will need to decide whether Norris adopts an aggressive approach from the start or conserves tires to attack in the second half of the race. In a sprint, the margins for error are minimal, so finding the right balance between speed and tire management will be crucial to maximizing the result. Regardless of the sprint result, the real test for Norris will be qualifying in Sunday's main race. McLaren will have the opportunity to analyze the data collected during the sprint and make adjustments to the car's setup to improve its performance in qualifying. If they can find a solution to the problems experienced in sprint qualifying, Norris will have a better chance of fighting for pole position in Saturday's session and securing a favorable position for Sunday's race. The championship fight is still open, and although this mistake in sprint qualifying has complicated Norris's weekend, he still has a chance to minimize the damage and maintain his lead in the Drivers' Championship. His performance in the sprints will be a key test in determining whether McLaren remains the team to beat or if his rivals have found a way to close the gap. The first day of the Chinese Grand Prix was an emotional roller coaster for Lando Norris and the McLaren team. What began as absolute dominance in free practice ended with a difficult sprint qualifying that left many doubts about the true performance of the MCL39. Norris showed he has the speed to lead, but mistakes in qualifying, combined with the car's sensitivity to windy conditions, have exposed weaknesses that could jeopardize his championship fight if not corrected in time. Despite this, McLaren remains one of the strongest teams on the grid, and their ability to adapt throughout the weekend will be key to determining whether they can make up lost ground and remain in contention for victory. The rest of the weekend in Shanghai remains open. The sprint race will be Norris's first opportunity to make up positions and minimize damage to the championship standings. His strategy, race pace, and tire management skills will be determining factors in his result in the short race. Beyond the sprint, the real battle will be fought in qualifying for the main race, where McLaren will have to analyze the data collected and adjust the car's setup to find the perfect balance on this demanding circuit. With Ferrari showing a solid performance, Mercedes lurking, and Red Bull yet to fully unleash its potential in Shanghai, the fight for victory remains open. Every session will count, and the teams can't afford to make mistakes if they want to stay in contention for the title. Norris's performance over the rest of the weekend will be a litmus test to determine whether he has what it takes to stay at the top of the championship or whether the pressure and technical difficulties of the MCL39 will open the door for his direct rivals. The question remains, can McLaren solve its problems and give Norris regain championship dominance? Don't miss it.